I analyzed 440 games of Riftbound to let you know decidedly if going first is better in that game or not. But to my immense enjoyment, it ended up not being as simple as that. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and let's get started. And to start us off, I'd like to briefly go over what the differences are for the player going first versus second, both obvious and implied. And if you know all that already, don't worry, I'm gonna be super quick and not belabor the obvious here. And to start with the obvious difference, the one present in the rules themselves, the player going second gets an additional rune. They start with 3 compared to the first player's 2, so that gives them immediate access to 3 drops, which might be very impactful. For example, I'm playing a lot of Annie lately, and having 3 energy available to me on turn 1 gives me immediate access to Sneaky Deckhand, which in turn allows me easy pickings of whichever battlefield I wanna start with. So that's the obvious difference. For the less obvious, that difference in runes is compounding. Assuming both players recycle at roughly the same rate, the player going second will have access to 1 more rune on their turn 2 as well as turn 3, turn 4, and onwards. On the flip side, going first gives you an immediate advantage in terms of tempo, how fast you're approaching actually winning the game. Your 2 drops are going to ready up first, which is very likely going to give you the first point, barring some deckhand sneakiness of course. It is then up to your opponent to equalize that point balance and maybe even attempt to overtake you before the game is over, using their access to the marginally more runes that they got as a sort of consolation prize. And indeed, in my analysis of 40 top-level tournament games that I did recently, you can click the link on screen right now to open that up for later, I think you might enjoy it, there were only 11 or 27.5% of those games where the player going second was the one to score the first point. So the added tempo from going first is a near guarantee of being ahead on points in the early game at least. As for other, smaller bits, the player going first actually mulligans first. So if you're taking your mulligan going second, you can do so forearmed with the knowledge of how happy your opponent was with their hand and how many cards from it they replaced. It doesn't matter that much as of now, but it might eventually as hand reads and information become an even bigger part of the game in the future, which is not a guarantee but is very much possible. So ultimately, it's a matter of finding out if these 2 sides of the equation balance out. Is the access to 1 extra rune per turn and that tiny added bit of mulligan info enough to make up for that big difference in tempo in the early turns? And hopefully, we're gonna find that out. As I started gathering the data, I took stock of my own expectations here. I fully expected, as is the case in most card games I've played, that the first player would be at a slight advantage in Riftbound. And indeed, my previous look into that 40-game sample revealed a pretty stark 75-25% split in winning going first versus second. And asking around, that seemed to be the common belief, which in turn could have a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy effect on the win rates that we were trying to observe. In best of 3 matches especially, you'll often find that your battlefields are not exactly created equal. It would thus make sense to tailor your choices in games 2 and 3, when you know if you'll be going first or second, to make sure you win the easier game, the one you perceive to be easier at least, the one that you'll be going first in. So that's when you'll pick your quote-unquote better battlefield. On a psychological level, though we are getting into shaky argument territory here, it might be more difficult for a player to win a match going second just because they will perceive that to be more difficult. Again, self-fulfilling prophecy. There's also the possibility that turning that point balance around, which you need to do if you're going second, is a harder skill that we collectively as the player base need to work on, harder than just, upholding an existing lead that you get from going first. So all of these required me to take a slightly novel way into how I formatted my data here. I would input each game in my file from the perspective of the player making the choice to go first or second. From now on, they will be called the active player. Let's say I win the die roll, I would note down the first game's result from my perspective. If I win that game, it is then my opponent's choice in game 2, so that's input from their perspective. Let's say they win game 2, it's back to me in game 3 to decide, and I am going to input that from my perspective as well. This also allowed us to measure how many players chose to go first when given the opportunity, which was another metric that I was interested in. Since there's only 2 options for how a game might end, if I pinky promise not to include draws, either the active player or their opponent wins, we can identify both the win rate of the player going first and second by seeing what the active player chose and whether they or their opponent won. This approach, however, required a great deal of scrutiny in making sure that both sides of each match would be input, so I decided to enlist an elite cadre of contributors to this project. A huge thank you go to Riftbound enjoyers Sevnin, Przyczajona Żaba, and especially Kapi, who also assisted me in the next phase of this project. And that next phase involved manually combing through upwards of 50 VODs, noting down all the choices, legends played, and who won in each of the games played in them, and this is a great opportunity for you to subscribe to the channel if you feel like it. Thank you very much. As a result, the data you're going to see is going to be representative of streamers of various levels of experience, their online opponents, as well as competitors in my local Nexus Night events. It might be less reflective of kitchen table games played among newcomers or the very highest echelons of competitive play, so keep that in mind. And the results we gathered are as follows. Out of 440 games, the active player chose to go first in 422 of them, or 95.91%. Out of the 18 players who chose to go second out of their own free will, 8 were on various flavors of Aurora, 4 on Yasuo, and the remaining 6 seemed somewhat new to the game, though that is just my impression and, not an actual data point. The win rate we observed was 54.77% in favor of the player going first. To explain exactly what that means, I'm going to introduce you to 2 very simple but very useful statistics concepts. The first of which being significance. This is a percentage chance of the effect we see here not arising randomly. It increases with the scale of the effect we observe, because it's harder to randomly see, say, 80% win rate than 55%, but also with sample size, because it's easier to randomly get a weird result in 10 games or 100 games than in 1,000 or 10,000. And for our 440 games, our confidence in first player win rate being better than 50-50 is 96.5%. That means that we are 96.5% sure that the results we see here did not arise out of random chance. And anything over 95% is accepted in scientific circles as significant, so I can say that our findings here are significant. Bear in mind, that doesn't mean that we are 96.5% sure that the actual win rate is exactly 54.7, just that it's not 50-50. But if we do another bit of statistical jujitsu here, we get 2 values that are called confidence intervals. These are values for which we can say with 95% certainty that the actual truth falls somewhere between them. And for our games, these are 50.12% and 59.42%. So to simplify, we can say with near certainty that the win rate on the play is no smaller than 50.12% and no bigger than 59.42%. Though, of course, it is likely to be closer to that 54-55% number that we've actually arrived at through observation here. Now, seeing these, a keen observer might ask me, is this a result of something inherent to the game's mechanics, or is it just the way the current meta shakes out? An even keener observer might ask me directly, Simon, what about Kai'Sa? And to that I say, since the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not much. But in all seriousness, things do get a little bit more interesting once we slice this data into Kai'Sa, hope I get focus on this, and non-Kai'Sa. 100 games on our list of 440 had the active player playing Kai'Sa. 64 of them were won by the Kai'Sa player, a tidy 64%. This in turn gives us a 99.99% confidence that Kai'Sa's win rate is higher than 50% on the play. However, since we are not comparing that to Kai'Sa's win rate going second, but rather to Kai'Sa's opponent's win rates, there is no telling what part of that high percentage is due to it being first player advantage, and what part of that is due to it being Kai'Sa. And perhaps a combination of these two factors would end up being greater than the sum of its parts. This limitation doesn't cause any problems with the findings in our overall situation, but it does put a limit on how useful slicing it into smaller parts is going to be. What's even more interesting is that after we excise the active Kai'Sa players, which would be the dream of many, the remaining active players only win going first 52.06% of the time. With our sample size, that means that their actual win rate might fall anywhere between 46.7 and 57.4, with only a 56% chance that the results we're seeing here are non-random, so that's non-significant. That means that even though the entire meta has present in it what we might call a going first effect, the non-Kai'Sa active player segment does not. And with the sample size we have in the non-Kai'Sa active player group, any effect over 58% or so we would hope to catch with a reasonable chance. So in a Kai'Sa-free meta, either the effect is smaller than 8% and we just haven't caught it, bad luck for us, or there is no effect to speak of. I'm personally leaning towards there being an effect, but it just being smaller than what we can catch with a sample this size. So I feel equipped to summarize the findings here as such. In the overall meta, a random player on a random legend playing another random player on a random legend, there is an advantage to going first. That advantage is likely smaller than 10%, probably somewhere within the 4 to 5% range if I were to be specific. A major contributor to that effect seems to be the existence of Kai'Sa as a deck. The effect is going to be especially marked if you're playing Kai'Sa yourself and going first or second, or if you're playing against Kai'Sa and allowing her to go first or second. That, of course, is going to be enhanced by Kai'Sa's huge prominence in the current meta. If I were to leave you with one last nugget of wisdom here, it is that findings that are true on average for a population might not necessarily apply to every member of that population. And to say that in a normal people way, just because it's better to go first overall for an average player playing an average deck against an average opponent, doesn't mean that it's going to be better for you to go first playing your deck against your opponent in your specific circumstances. So, utilize your best judgment when choosing to go first or second, but unless you have a strong reason to prefer one over the other, I would still recommend you go first. Thanks a lot for watching, and a special thank you go to all the Patreon supporters over on patreon.com/gamesdeconstructed, especially Jakub Burdun, Maciej Majka, and Dillinger. Thanks a lot for watching, I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed, and I hope to see you in the next one.